It gives me an immense pleasure to turn it over to our two speakers for tonight, Eileen Tabias and Luisa Igloria. Eileen and Luisa, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Good evening.
Hi, everyone. You know, we didn't even, we didn't rehearse or discuss anything prior to this conversation. So down to the bottom of who goes first, we didn't even discuss that. So since I'm talking now, Luisa, would you like to begin with some remarks on the theme?
Sure. And we did not even, plan the outfit, but somehow we got the clairvoyant memo. Anyway, and it is colder now. So this topic is very interesting to me and very interesting to Eileen, I'm sure, because she is the great prolificness with so many novels and so many things in the works. I'm just amazed by everything that Eileen does. I think you just came out with a new book and you have several more in the wings waiting. About the idea of prolificness, I try to think about it more in terms of like an abundance or maybe a generosity of whatever it is that we are working on. So as some of you have read in my bio, for the last, it's going to be 13 years now this November, that I have been maintaining a daily writing practice where I try to write at least a poem a day. And we'll probably get into the weeds of that, maybe talk about craft and stuff like that later on. But for me, it came out of this, the usual, all of us feel like we have too little time. We have so many things that we are attending to in our lives, and we crave that time which we wish to protect so that our creativity can continue to, be that fountain of generosity and prolificness, right? So we can work on the things that are closest to our hearts and imaginations. And so I think at heart, it's a question about time. But we also know that time is an illusion, or so we are told. Hence, we are turning back the clocks this weekend. Is that right? Yeah. So anyway, the concepts of time, I think for me, I like to think about that promise of inexhaustibility, that there will be some place where things will continue to come from, or at least that's my hope. And when I think about writing and all the other things that we do also as forms of energy, then I try to do my best to focus on those instead of on the other things that I'm sure we'll get to talk about, like when people say, how much is too much, or don't you think you'll ever stop? Or, how many publications will it take to make you happy, right? So I think I'll stop there and then we can continue this conversation. Eileen, over
Yes.
to you.
I was taking notes on your wisdom for.
Hey?
But I will say that I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad that Luisa exists, not just as a person, but as a writer, because there is no one else with whom I could have imagined having this conversation, a poem a day every day for 13 years plus, or at least a poem a day. And so this conversation is unrehearsed, but we asked each other to give some starting comments. And so what I want to share about myself before I address Luisa is, I want to share with you the very first book I ever made. I made it as a toddler. I was 2 to 5 years old, depending on who you ask. Apparently, as a toddler, I took a piece of paper, I folded it, right? And then with a Crayola, I couldn't read or write at the time, but I took a green Crayola, did some slash at the bottom, and I read it to my mother as, "The grass is green." And then I turned the page of my book. And then I did something like with a yellow Crayola, some circle, and I read it as, "The sun is out shining." And then I went to my next page of my book and I scrawled with a brown Crayola, something at the bottom, which I read as, "The sun has browned the grass." And that was my very first book. You're welcome. I'm happy to share it with you. And my second book incident I want to share is that when I was about 11, 12, or 13 years old in middle school, I was lugging around Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago. I had it clasped around my breast. I was young, so I was probably doing this. I lugged it around through school and every day for a matter of months. And the reason I did that is because I loved its weight. I loved its feel against my body. I'm not sure I actually ever read it straight through anyway. I share those because the whole basis for my being prolific is that it's the book. I love books, and I loved the book, and I wanted to write a lot of books. And in order to do that, I had to write a lot of content. It's possible that I'm not so interested in the individual poem as I am in the poetry collection, or the individual essay as I am in the essay collection, or the individual short story as the short story collection. And this is why I love the novel, because except for its experimental tendencies, it's inherently a thicker book. That's why I'm prolific. And it's a chosen aesthetic, it's an aesthetic decision on my part. The reason is that I have this impossible ambition that when you see the author's name as Eileen Artabius, it actually needs to be synonymous with the word world. I wanted the author to be the world. And that meant that I could write on anything I wanted to write on, anything and everything. And it's not just an ambition. I realized much later in my development, it's a matter of manifesting kapwa, where the Filipino indigenous trait, where everything is supposed and everyone is interrelated across all time and space. And so poetry to me is very limited when it's only writing. To me, poetry is history, art, culture, science, technology, leading up to everything. I call myself poet because that's the only category that can encompass everything in my mind. And so I am a poet, therefore I am prolific. And that's what I want to say about how I approach this theme. Thank you.
I love that story. And since I don't have a similar show and tell object like Eileen does, you kept that, and that's amazing. I do have a book-related story, which I will share. Perhaps some of my students, if they are here, have probably heard me tell this story countless times. But I totally agree that the source of all of these pleasures, the way in which we connect so intensely with literature, is because we started that relationship far back in time in our youth. And so I was taught by my parents to read very young. I was 3 when I learned to read. They also started me on music lessons in the same year, reading music, what is the term? Solfeo. And my parents loved taking me to anything that might, in their minds, feed my artistic imagination and just provide that environment as much as they could. And so there was this bookstore in Baguio called Ato, the Ato bookstore, and my mother liked to frequent it. And as a child, she would take me there and browse. And this book, it's Estrella de Alfon's Magnificence and Other Stories. Estrella de Alfon is probably one of the most wonderful short story writers in English from the Philippines. She is Cebuana. And my mother inscribed the date and a little, dedication to me on the cover, not on the inside. And there is a date. I was 5 years old. What were they doing giving me books like this? But I remember reading them and actually loving the stories in there, even if I had, not as much knowledge of the world yet as a child. I didn't know what the places were that she was referring to, but there was something I could intuit. And the ways in which the tales are told also kind of instructed me. And I think every book that we read and that we come to love is also in itself an instruction on how to write, even if they aren't, speaking to us from the front of a classroom. So I was also thinking about prolificness as you were saying, in terms of this sort of circulating energy of imagination and love that's shared by writers. And you can tap into this. It's like this great long conversation that has been going on, and you can jump into that and you can find your place in it. You can step out if you want to take a little respite, but it's there for us. I also wanted to think about prolificness in terms of, I wanted to see what other examples of writers are there that we all know. And of course, immediately what came to mind, since I was also reading the Arabian Nights as a child, I was given one of those books too. And the original, of course, is Shahrazad's story, the 1001 Nights, where her act of narrativation, her act of storytelling is really a way to postpone death or the inevitable, right? And I was thinking, do we have any equivalent in the Philippines? I can only think, maybe Eileen, you can help me. I can only think of Lola Basham. You know, there's this story of a grandmotherly figure who tells stories to the children who come gather at her feet in the evening. And they have been anthologized in many forms. And I think about that as, you know, the figure that a Lola Bashang, or a grandmother, Lola means grandmother, that this author or this bearer of tales cuts. I see the importance there of the preservation of stories and the way in which we can pass culture down to another generation, and that they're told in this very amiable setting where we are feeling at home in that circle of storytelling is such a beautiful picture to me of where that upwelling of prolific imagination is first fed and then can be sustained. Do you know any other figures from Filipino literature, Eileen?
No, but actually, I'm not the right person to ask that, because I left the Philippines at age 10. And so I'm really more of a Phil-Am versus a Philippine. So
yeah.
As is typical of many immigrants to the U.S., and perhaps some in the audience would know this, you come over here and everyone is, you are pushed to assimilate if you want to not just accomplish something, but to survive. You've got to assimilate.
Right.
And so I actually didn't get back to paying attention to Filipino culture. So from age 10, I didn't pay attention to Filipino culture until I became a writer, which was in my mid-30s. I didn't know that I was missing anything either. Also, all my frame of references lacked the Philippine knowledge or Philippine reference for that reason. But on the other hand, I mean, rightly or wrongly, in terms of as a way to look at it, I don't know that I would, I mean, I'm not the go-to person in Philippine or Filipino or even Phil-Am literature.
I'm just curious.
No, I mean, I'm just, no, I mean, but you know, I don't read, how to put this without offending anybody. I don't read or choose to read or pay attention to artists who are brown as a deliberate thing to privilege their voices or uplift them. I just, you know, read as widely as I can. And obviously, of course, that includes our communities. I mean, this is certainly odd, because as I'm talking to you, I'm feeling the tension from when I first began as a writer, of being pushed to pay attention to certain authors and certain topics and certain matters just because I'm a brown woman, you know, which I've always decried. If anything, I'm much more offensive, pun intended. I don't mind going out there into the Western canon because I want to prove what I'm just as good as whatever you can produce. There is that competitiveness in me. Ooh, I didn't want to say that today, but there is that competitiveness in me.
I totally get where that's coming from.
Right? Which is not to say that you shouldn't be paying attention to your culture, of course. It's just that something else is going on with me. But I'm, you know, the reason why I wanted to have this discussion with you too is that on prolificness, I feel that something happens because of scale. That there's something that happens specifically because you are doing a lot of it over a prolonged period of time.
Yeah.
And that you, people listening to us, there were many ways to write, of course, many ways to create art, but you cannot get that understanding without going through the process of having put in enough time. And I know a lot of writers who, and it is as legitimate a approach as anything, but if they come up with that one great book in their writing career, that's not only good enough, but it is way more than sufficient, and it is a marvelous achievement. But for those who are actually being prolific, there is this scale issue. And I'm curious, for example, as to how that might have affected your your creation of poems, just because you've been doing it the way you've been doing it. Yeah, yeah.
And
it's
this is why
consistent and prolific, and yeah.
Yes. And so I totally relate to that. And I think that this is why I have come to think of what I do as a daily practice, with the emphasis on doing. And since I'm an etymology nerd, of course, I looked up, what is the root of prolific and prolificness. And there is something to do with making, facere, prolific. And back in old 1600 texts, they referred to that. So the practice of doing something over and over again, but not necessarily doing the same things all the time, I think is a wonderful way to manifest what we are. We are curious. We want to know how to explore something further than its first iteration, right? And it's not merely a sign of writerly, I don't know, ADHD or something. So it's our desire to keep, turning a question over and over, coming back to it, seeing what else might be said, seeing what else we can do with it. What can it show us that it hasn't shown us before? And it might feel like this is like rife ground for just mindless repetition, but in my experience, it actually has not been that way. And I guess I'm very grateful for that. So I like to think about my writing and being prolific in this way. I have come to realize that this is probably my favorite place to go to process whatever information that the world is giving me. And I say information in terms of everything, like, what is your intellect receiving from the world? What are you feeling, and what do you hear? How is it something that you also process in language as well as in feeling and in thought? And maybe, thinking about music a little bit too. How does it sound? So for me, those have become like very important considerations in the practice of writing every day. So it teaches us a lot of things also. It teaches me, I find that it's a wonderful place to give or to go for a kind of biofeedback on my own habits as a writer. Because I do go back to things and look them over and maybe even revise, and maybe things that I have written, let's say 2 years ago, I go back and read them and I see, well, I could do something else with this. And then another poem is born because it's no longer the same thing. So these are not fixed stops on the way to something that you feel, is like a goal, an end goal, or like when I get there, I'm done, right? It's not that way for me. So again, it's that idea of that, for me, the promise of that inexhaustibility that I'm always trying to find my way to, because this is where one of the places where I'm most happy, which is a really simple question, a simple answer, but I think that is the truth. Is it the same for you?
Yes, I think sometimes I can't stand all these angst-ridden observations that writers make about their writing and all that, because it should be, your writing site should be, I mean, ideally, is a space of pure bliss, pure joy. You should be so happy writing that you should just be so happy while you're doing it that you relish it, whether or not it gets published, whether or not it's any good. It's just that the act itself, the participation in writing, it should be just a source of
pure
joy.
I agree. And doing this, what we do, which is being prolific at what we do, I think is a way of expanding, maybe hopefully, some of the conversations, or changing the conversations that we all enter into about writing or art making or creation. Because people ask questions like, can you not stop and just consider yourself done, or aren't you happy, are you satisfied, which seems to imply to me that abundance somehow diminishes something in the quality of the work, which I don't agree with. And then there are people who use metaphors like your writing has to deepen with time, has to age like wine, you have to take it slow. Or in Tagalog, there's this, I've heard people say dahan-dahan bigla also, which is sort of like, go fast slowly. How would you translate that? Anyway, so all of these things to get tied in with other kinds of qualities, like publication viability, how many books you've sold, and marketability, and sustaining the attention of so many people or followers. And to me, that becomes really beside the whole point, because I agree with you about, this should be about finding happiness in what you do, to put it simply. And people also hand out advice like, if you're new to writing, aim to do more. Yes, right. So what does it mean? Does it mean established writers don't have to care about producing more anymore? So these are, for me, these are just false dichotomies.
They're false. They're artificial.
You're
reminding me of something someone advised me when I first began as a newbie writer. They said you should try not to. You should limit yourself to releasing one book every 5 years when it's poetry, a poetry book. They said, don't do more than one book every 5 years. Now, this is before the advent of printing technology, where we have PODs and all that. So there was an economic aspect to it that may or may not exist today. But the idea was just don't do more than one poetry book every 5 years, because the market's limited anyway. So the two responses I immediately had to that was why I would ever allow someone else or someone's else's, like the market, to tell me how I create or write. I'm not gonna do that. But the other thing that it affected in me is it made me actually want to do the radical opposite, which is publish as many books as I could.
Yeah, I think I share that same instinct. Right. Are you Virgo too? Are you Virgo?
I'm a Virgo.
I'm Virgo
we're
too.
So irritating, Louisa. We're Virgos. So, I mean, there have been days when times when I've released 5 books a year rather than, one every 5 years. And I always loved that particular statistic when I hit it, because, because of that original piece of advice. But, I also want to say that I would never tell anybody how to respond to something I write. I mean, that's not my job. And I actually thought when I was writing a lot in the beginning, I assumed, because this was when I was a younger, less experienced writer, that they weren't that good or whatever, just because, you gotta improve with time, whatever. But because I had nothing else to do with the sheafs of poems and short stories I was writing, I started submitting them out. So when something that I, in the privacy of my writing studio, would say, okay, that's B rather than, I'd give it a B rather than A. When nonetheless that is met with enthusiasm by someone who then wants to publish it. I mean, what am I going to do? Like, second guess that and say you cannot respond that way because of this? So I think, to me, it all depends. All this stuff about you should only do so much, or you should write this way or whatever. You know what? The test is the writing itself. If you choose to share it out there, does it get an audience? Why did it get an audience? I mean, it got the people who are reading it doesn't know that it's one of like 5 poems you wrote that day, versus something you labored over for a year. It's just, it depends on the work itself, I guess. is what I'm saying. So
I agree with all of those notions too. And I think the idea of having that freedom in that space of writing to do all of the things that you just described is part of why it's so important to us, I think. And so when you also go back into your where you write or where you keep your writing, I know I keep both electronic versions and a few notes here and there. Being able to go back and look at it in ways that are not dictated necessarily by, I don't know, trends or ideas that are external or that you feel are not really the thing that you're trying to explore. Then you have a way of like looking at this production, let's say, this abundance, as a place to listen more deeply to how these works are talking to each other, and talking to you, or maybe implicating each other. And I know that we go back in and we borrow things from even ourselves, right? Because we do that with the things that we read. So there's nothing, I think that's very organic and natural to the process of reading and writing. So I'm very interested in themes about history and place, but I'm also very interested in speculation. I'm interested in myth, for instance, but I'm also interested in variation. I am interested in form, but I'm also interested in seeing how much you can do with a traditional container when you apply certain things that don't normally get associated with it in that exploration. So I see my writing practice of, this abundance, this prolificness as a place to experiment and to play, basically playfulness. I think we forget that is a very integral part to creative production. Once it's no longer fun, I mean, why are you even doing it, right? And you probably are going to be really unhappy or something. Anyway, so I use it
you should have fun even when you're complaining about the
yeah,
process.
true.
You absolutely be enjoying your every second of your complaint.
I mean, complaining.
It should also be happy. It should all be happiness. Writing should be happiness in that sense.
Yeah.
You're reminding me of even just this morning. I've been going. The thing with being prolific is that you do end up with a significant body of work. And I've been going back to some old poems and reusing them in the novels I'm writing. And actually, it gets harder and harder for me nowadays to create a poetry manuscript because I'm paying attention to the form of the novel. But what's interesting is that I went back a few months ago and realized that there was a book-length set of poems I'd written contextualized within the body of a novel. I took all those poems out to create the only currently completed poetry manuscript I have. It's called the Encanto's Diary, where for the first time I'm paying attention to the poems as individual poems versus as part of what was moving forward the novel's narrative. And that's been sheer joy. And so if we go back and forth to this body of work, and now you're going back not just as a writer, but as a reader, which is also a separate pleasure in itself, then you get the rewards that way, I guess.
Yeah. And one of the things that I have liked doing, one of the forms that I have liked experimenting with in my own way, in my daily writing practice, I have written some sonnet crowns. They're not in iambic meter or any of that, but I do, observe some of the distinct features of the form. And for me, it's a way of sustaining a thought and finding a way to attach it to other kinds of questions, maybe, that will naturally come in the wake of your first proposition of it in a line. You plunk down a line, put down a line, and of course, a line must follow, and another line after that, and so forth and so on. So how do you make sense of that? And for me, form is a way of trying to make sense of things while still having the freedom to use the internal capacity of the form itself as a way to liberate other kinds of ideas or other forms of expression, maybe. So I was just, I don't know, maybe it's Halloween. I was joking. I'm teaching a nonfiction workshop this semester, as well as a poetry workshop at the nonprofit writing center, the Muse in Norfolk. And people are always asking about revision. How do I fix this? How do I change this, right? So I give them a few like practical things to do, like what you were saying. You took out this body of poems that were hiding in plain sight in the novel. So I said, look at stuff that you have lying around. Maybe you have drafts that you haven't really made sense of. Cut them in half. See what comes out when you move the pieces around. Take an idea from here or a phrase here or a line there. And because it was Halloween, I was making jokes about, yeah, do organ donation of poems, right?
Right, right. And I think that relates to actually the number one use I have, and which I certainly suggest for everybody else, is reading. It's reading that will generate your writing. If you read a lot and you want to be a writer, you shouldn't have writer's block unless there's something else going on.
Yay, yeah. I'm not the only one saying that.
Oh, okay, yeah. And I'm so happy to say that you're saying that, because, you know, she's in, I never studied writing. What I did was I read a lot. That's
that is studying writing.
That
right.
is. So,
yeah. I tell my students, and they are aghast. They're like, oh, what did she just say? And I say, I don't believe in writer's block anymore. Sorry.
Right.
And I say, we can talk about other things. It's
Right.
not the paralysis that you think it is. Like when you pause, it is not because there is nothing, right? There are other things going on.
And I think this relates to the energy matter that you raised earlier too, because one of, when you feel part of the energy is when you feel like you're tapping into something larger than yourself. I know that for that reason, when I write a poem, all I need is one word. I never know what my poems will look like. I need that first word, and then I go, and it's the writing process itself that produces the next word and the next word. And when I step back from the poem, then I know what the poem is about. This, to me, is what, as the saying goes, the poem dictates itself, or the writing reads itself. And that's because we tap into a certain energy. I guess I wonder if that means that one test of the writing process is if you, the writer, feel that you are writing something and you are fully aware of and therefore in control of what it is you're writing, then you're probably like also closing the door and windows to other stuff to come in that might actually enhance your writing just because it would introduce surprise. Because the last thing you want to do is bore people. So I always want my writings to have surprise in them. And it should. If you
so those windows are you're saying, if I'm hearing you right, you're saying that you should keep those windows open.
Yeah. And it's but that, I assume, is easier said than done for many writers. At least that's the impression I get sometimes.
But if you do it all the time,
I mean, I don't know any other way of doing it.
So,
but you know, one reason why it's easy for me to do that is because I happen to think that my personal life is like one of the most boring things in the world. So for me to write, I don't write about myself in a way just because that would bore me. So I write, well, what's interesting out there in the world? And you look out into the universe, and all of a sudden you realize there's so many interesting things.
There are.
There. And one way for me to enjoy these interesting things is to integrate them in the writing.
Right. So like I said earlier, for me, it is the place that I prefer to go to now to think through. And when I say think, I'm really not just thinking of intellect. I'm thinking of, thinking as a whole bodily process. And I think I wrote something like this in that anthology of poetics essays that I co-edited with my former grad student, Amanda Wynn of Collar. It struck me that, when I saw the sculpture of Rodin, the thinker, in its like, up close and personal, I could see the sinews and the muscles, and thought is a physical act. It has to pass through a body. So why are we not taking that into account, right?
thinking is definitely muscular. Now, I think you and I can go on and on about how lovely and how much we enjoy writing, but maybe we should turn to the dark side a little bit.
Side.
And so what is the cost, if anything, to this prolificness?
The cost.
Capital lowercase c.
I don't really know how to think about that, because maybe it's a function of getting older. I just feel like the complications in life that we feel, and they're different for everyone, but they are also to a certain extent determined by things like physical capacity, what you can do, what you can actually do with the body, or where you are in life, things that you can access and a certain amount, a certain level of safety that you might feel. Where can you do this where you feel safe? The world has gotten more complicated. Life has gotten more complicated, right? And so the dark side is really all of that. How do you keep that hope going, right? And for me, again, the answer is the writing. It is the thing that might be impinged upon by all of these, what you call the dark side. But it's also the place from which a response can, I think, be drawn. So it's a kind of, not conundrum, but a paradox, right?
Yeah. I just asked the question. I don't have an answer to it.
You don't? Okay, I don't know that was smart or anything, but did you want to read a poem?
Oh, please go ahead first, because I have to go look for that poem.
Do we want to read one poem each before we go to the...
I didn't realize time went by so fast.
Yeah, I know.
And I was going to talk about, all our struggles and all that, but never mind.
Yeah. So anyway, so I wrote, and I hope people will forgive me for being personal also, but I wanted to read a poem which came out of recent writing. My mother recently died at the end of September. So I've been writing through that. Again, the writing is a way to sift through and to kind of make sense of anything that's going on. It's not just from life, of course, but it's from everything that we pass through and that passes through us. So I would like to read a poem which I wrote on October 16, called Consolation. When you died, I heard from the son of the neighbor whose orchids cascaded over our fence. The news of your death traveled far, bringing back a memory not only of cream-colored flowers, but also of that time we inhabited. House lots touching, the sole streetlight on the corner besieged nightly by dark-stoled insects. The world was full of the ache of wanting or losing, for whatever it was we owed or lacked. That has not changed. I think of you as on a boat headed for a destination none of us could describe, not even after we arrived there, stripped of our bones, our loves. I want to imagine only the wind's wide arms, threaded not with emptiness, but with fragrance.
Thank you, Louisa. That was beautiful. The kind of beauty I've come to expect from all your poems. Poetry reading. I'll just share. I do want to share a couplet poem, just because it shows my my love for books. I really cannot stress that enough. It's titled "Your Loss," but with a Y in parentheses in the title, so it could be our loss. Because I loved you as if you were a book. And then the poem that I want to write is, I often integrate books into my poems because I love them. This is a poem that I wrote while I was annotating the movie, The Professor and the Madman, which is the history of the Oxford English Dictionary. And it's titled, If Love, Then Love. 1. All I need are books, Every word in action becomes beautiful in the light of its own meaning. When I read, no one is after me. When I read, I am the one who is chasing after God. What I know of love, the sickness often becomes the cure. The brain is wider than the sky. Madness gave us words. Sometimes when we push away, that's when we need to be resisted. I wanted to document the history of each and everything, to offer the world a book that gives a meaning of everything in God's creation. The book, it's not yours to quit. I know the answer to the widow's question. And we are open for questions, I think. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Beautiful reading.
That was so beautiful. Thank you both. We are very used to starting events with poetry. It's something that we do quite often, but you both have inspired me to think about ending events with poetry, because what a beautiful way to cap off your discussion. So thank you both for that. We're going to start the Q&A. We have some really great questions. And if folks have any more, please, like I said, feel free to submit them using the Q&A button. This first one, maybe it'll give you a chance to talk about some of the challenges that you might not have had time for in the discussion. Have you ever written 2 books at one time? And do you view that project as is it a problem or is it an opportunity?
I certainly have. And I think the process of putting those books together as individual books is also something that you're doing at the same time. And the book that's coming out in 2024 from Black Lawrence Press is a product of this sort of like double work, or double attention. I also have another manuscript besides Callbearer, which is doing the rounds, but I worked on those at the same time. So yeah, I think again, it's just this curiosity and just excitement to see them come together. That's for me.
Yeah, a long time ago, I used to say jokingly that the definition of a poet is someone with 3 unpublished manuscripts minimum in their files. So I certainly write and have released more than 1 book at a time. Where it becomes difficult for me is when a few years ago, I started paying a more focused attention to the genre of the novel. And the novel is interesting. It's because I discovered that the novel is jealous and forces and demands that you pay attention only to it and no one and nothing else. The poetry manuscripts never did that to me. So it's so that's what I'm balancing now, precisely because this particular genre, at least for me, seems to not want to share me with anything else, whether it's other types of writing or even with my husband or my pets or anything. It's a very demanding, jealous muse. So yeah.
And then on kind of the opposite end of the spectrum, have either of you ever had a time where you didn't do any writing, either intentionally or even unintentionally, took a break, or had some kind of writing block? And there's a couple of questions. I'll just combine them and feel free to pick and choose. How did you overcome that? What advice do you have for somebody who's undergoing that kind of a writer's block? And if somebody hasn't really written in a while, what are your thoughts on working with a writing coach?
Mylene, want to start off?
Well, I have a different, thank you, Louisa. I do have a different background though, because I wasn't a creative writer, so to speak, until I was about 35 years old. So to start that quote late, and I was hanging out with peers who were 10 years younger, because that's what emerging writers are really. And many were going to the MFA programs. And then when I took a look at writers my age, in my mid to late 30s, they already were relatively accomplished. So for the first maybe at least 5 years of my writing life, I felt I imposed a lot of pressure on myself to catch up. Consequently, I had to write a lot because I had to catch up with my age peers. And what happened, though, is that when you do that over a prolonged period of time, and again, this is the effect of scale, what happens is something clicks, and all of a sudden you're doing that kind of, quote, prolificness naturally, just because that's what you've been doing for a long enough time. I've never had a writer's block, only be, or I should say, if I have, it would be when I turn to more wide reading. Reading cures it for me. So.
Oh yeah, me too. I turn to a book immediately when I feel, perhaps before my writing practice, before I intentionally started that, perhaps I had felt more of that sort of like temporary stasis or paralysis that we talk about and associate with writer's block. And I knew that there were ways to circumvent it. I just knew that there had to be. And so when I told myself, give yourself the time and space every day. And for me, it is not a particular time of day. I don't set aside like 7 to 8 at night. It's whenever I can find time to drop into that writing space. And I take it gladly. And when I'm there, don't talk to me. I won't answer my phone. I won't cook anything. I'm just there for me and my writing. So,
Eileen, do you have any similar kind of containers or rituals for your practice? That's actually another question that came up. So I love that.
Yeah, listing. I list. I keep a diary. The list of listing the very mundane aspects of the task of writing. So I would say, I wrote 3 words today, or I wrote 3 chapters today, or I researched this today, or I researched that today. When you list the tasks aspect of what you physically, logistically did as a writer to create something new, or I looked up this matter today, or I read about this today. When you list the mundane tasks, I find that for me, that gives me both an incentive, because I've got to fill up my page of lists, an incentive to persevere, and also it affirms. It's a physical, to look at something is a physical affirmation that I'm doing something that's worth the time, and that energizes me.
Yeah, and I don't do the same thing as you, but I do keep word banks or lists of words also. And especially starting with the pandemic, when we were all kind of like really, really into our isolation, I started doing art again. I used to draw and paint, but during the pandemic, and I'm keeping it up now, I started doing more collage work. And that to me was also very additionally liberating for my own writing practice, because I felt like I was physically, playing with materials. And that also helped translate some of the things that I would get to when I finally sat down to write.
Right. I actually wonder if actually what happens with writing and prolific writing is that it gives you more of an impetus to do something that's more physically tactile, just because writing itself is so mental. For example, I'm going to take up drawing again. And I am the most incompetent visual artist in the world, but I just need the physicality of something. And I think that if you write so much, you maybe need that more for balance.
Right. And collage work, it's wonderful because you're always picking up ephemera, bits and pieces. And it really is like a counterpart of what we do also as writers, right? We're always picking up bits and pieces that are interesting. We're like magpies. Oh, shiny.
Right. We're obnoxious that way too. So
along those lines about process, what do you do to help yourself to feel like a piece is done? There's this urge to kind of always feel like your work could be a little bit better. Do you have that urge, or at what point are you like, okay, I'm finished, this is complete?
For me, I think along with the prolific writing practice that I have come to find myself in, I think I have also learned to revise fairly quickly. I go back and revise fairly quickly. So there's always this running conversation between me and my work. And so when I feel it finished, I guess, I don't know, you kind of hear some click in your head, or you see or feel it, the language feels like it's there, then I guess it tells you, because if you keep going back to it, there must be something more it's telling you.
Right. A few years ago, I decided that if when I draft a poem and I was unsatisfied with it, I don't bother revising. I crumple it up and throw it out. I just figured that if it was that good, or aspects of it were that good, it would return in subsequent writing. So I don't do as much revision as I used to now, because I don't let it go that far. If I'm struggling with something, it's crumpled and trashed, and I start anew. Yeah.
We have time for, I think, maybe 2 more questions. Can you both speak to how truth and integrity are maintained in this space of writing so much and having such a kind of high volume?
No, what I want to say is that prolificness is also a responsibility. And for me, that means that I've got to try to, as much as possible, not to be self-centered or selfish, but instead pay attention to what the rest of the world around me is going through. And perhaps they integrate themselves in my writing. I'm sure inevitably much of it will. But one of the I don't know, rules I have for myself if I want to be prolific is you can't be a selfish, selfish about it. You've got to, if you want the world to be a synonym for your name as a byline, you've got to pay attention to the world and respond to the world. The writing itself should be, ideally, I don't always meet this standard, but ideally, the writing is a beginning to something, including action. So if you're going to be prolific, it's more important to me that you are more responsible as a human being.
And that responsibility, I agree. That responsibility also comes with this sort of unstated, but it's there, tacit agreement that you allow yourself to be vulnerable on the page of your own writing. And I've had occasional students say things like, well, on a lazy day, can't you just, plunk down a haiku and hainaku and say, I'm done? But that would not feel right for me, because that model does not correspond to the way I view my writing practice. The idea that it's there's a meter ticking, that's not the idea that I'm engaged in at all.
Thank you both. So our last question for the night, with so much material under your belt, where do you find constant sources of inspiration? Is it changing? Is there a constant source? What inspires you?
It's always books and other writing and other forms of creative expression. It's also, I mean, the whole world. You can't really pin it down to one particular thing. But if, again, you are a poet and you cultivate this practice of attention, you are, it's bound to happen that you are going to be affected by and inspired by, or, moved by, in so many different ways, all of these things that surround you.
I would say that what Luisa said is probably 90% of my answer to a question like that. And the other 10%, which reflects the fact that we're older now, is that I need to forgive myself for a lot of decisions I made as a writer, because my priority was writing.
Yeah, that's a really good reminder.
Yeah.
The forgiveness. Yeah. And also a lot of people do things that are very hard on themselves. And I'm also guilty of that often. And of course, many of my daughters who are also writers will check me if they can. So that's good.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much. We are just at time. I feel like I've learned so much in such a short period of time and could continue listening for hours and hours. I'm so grateful to you both for joining us. Thank you, everyone, for joining us to listen and learn from these two wonderful speakers and writers. The event will be recorded and put on our YouTube channel. For future AAWW events, we have a ton of stuff coming up. Check us out, aaww.org. Louisa and Eileen, thank you both so much. What a pleasure and honor to hear from you tonight.
Thank you so much for hosting us. And thank you, Eileen. I could go on talking forever.
Oh, I know. And we should, but this time it shouldn't be virtual. It should be over food that you prepared for me, right?
Yeah. Thank you all for coming to listen.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.